People are under a lot of stress. There's a lot of unknowns of what's happening in the marketplace. I think as a leader and as a manager of people, you have to take that into consideration as you're moving your office environment to a home environment. And now your team is distributed. And, in some cases, people take some while to learn how to work from home.
Welcome to the Modern Marketing Engine podcast, hosted by Bernie Borges. This is the podcast for the modern marketer who wants to hear from their peers in the trenches and the occasional analyst or rockstar influencer sharing strategies and tactics about what's working in modern marketing. Be sure to listen to the end of each episode for Bernie's summary and takeaways so you can plan your next move in your own modern marketing journey.
This episode is sponsored by Zant, the enterprise leader in sales engagement. Zant has authored the definitive guide to sales cadence. Get your copy at salescadenceguide.com. Again, that's salescadenceguide.com. Hey there! Welcome to episode 275 of the Modern Marketing Engine podcast. I'm Bernie Borges, CMO of Vengreso, and your host. Hey, thanks for listening. Hey, my guest on this episode is Matt Langie, CMO at Zant. Matt, welcome to the Modern Marketing Engine podcast.
Hey, thanks, Bernie. Great to be here.
Absolutely. Well, we are here to discuss a very, very timely topic, and that is managing a remote marketing team. It is kind of the new normal now with everybody working remotely. So before we get into that, Matt, as you know, I always like to begin with a brief introduction to your company. And of course, your company is the sponsor of this episode, so my listeners hearing the sponsor message. But give a little more context. Tell us a little bit about who is Zant and a little bit about your role there and maybe your journey as well to get there.
Thank you, Bernie. Again, great to be here. I love this podcast. You always cover such great and interesting information, and I'm excited and honored to be a guest here. And so about Zant, we are a modern sales engagement platform for the enterprise. So what we do is we help companies and their sellers better connect with buyers. And we do that through software and data. And so our software is a sales engagement platform. We recently also announced as part of that, really the first mobile capability in the marketplace. So we can help you, whether you're working from a desktop machine or now a mobile device, to better connect sellers to buyers. And what that means is that with our data, we can really help sellers understand the behavior of buyers. When do they answer phone calls? How do they respond to text messages? Kind of not just the who and the what, but the how of how you engage a buyer in today's environment. That's especially important now that many of us, if not most of us, are working from home. Yeah, it's really important to know how your buyer is going to react to a phone call or a text or an email, and what are the right cadences you can set in place to effectively engage with those buyers. The other thing I would say is that what's really important, what we found, especially if you're in an enterprise organization, you're no longer selling to just a single contact. You're selling to a buying group. So we've got some new technologies and some capabilities in our sales engagement platform that really enable you to understand what does that buying group look like. So it's the 5 to 8 to 10 people sometimes that are responsible for really driving close on a deal. So really important to have that information.
Well, as you know, your sponsor message is a call to action to download your ultimate guide to sales cadence. So glad you mentioned that. And of course, my listener will hear more about that. But how did you get there? I mean, I always like to give my listener a little bit of that context and how you got to be the CMO at Zant.
Sure. Interesting story, in fact. I came to Zant. I've been here about a year now. And I originally was brought into the business by the chief operating officer at the time, Chris Harrington, who is now the CEO. Chris and I go back to the late 2000s at a company called Omniture, which many of your listeners may know. It was the original business that Adobe acquired to build that now $2+ billion digital marketing business that they have. So I was the first product marketer at Omniture, helped to build that team and that organization. Came in around 120 million in revenue and left around 1.3 billion in ARR. And so Chris was running sales. I was running product marketing. I went off and left Adobe after the acquisition about 7.5 years later after joining Omniture, was the CMO for a number of software startups, all of which were not located in my hometown here in Salt Lake City, Utah. So I was commuting across the country and then got a call from Chris saying, hey, let's do sushi. Kind of an out of the blue phone call. And we went and did sushi, and he sold me on this idea of, at the time was called InsideSales.com.
Mm-hmm.
And so I joined the company and we drove a rebrand for the organization and really relaunched the company. So it's a wholly different company than if anyone knows InsideSales.com, new leadership team, new go-to-market, new products, and obviously the new brand of Zant.
I'm glad you mentioned that because perhaps some listeners might be familiar with the previous brand, InsideSales.com. It was a good brand in terms of its awareness. So I know the Zant brand is still relatively new. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Well, Matt, I remember not too long ago, I think the dates were February 25, 26, 27, if I'm not mistaken. Your company, Zant, had a terrific event in Salt Lake City called Next 2020. That was your conference. And it was, of course, a physical in-person conference. In fact, Mario, our CEO, was one of your speakers there. And then a couple of weeks later, I was at a conference on March 10th. And of course, I remember a lot of conversation at that event that I was at around coronavirus and the impact that it was having. And no handshaking was happening at that conference on March 10th. And then fast forward just literally a few days after that conference, I don't remember the exact date. Seems like everything changed. It seems like we really are dealing with an overnight phenomenon. And of course, let's not undervalue and underestimate the impact that it's having on people in terms of lives and our health and our families. And that's, of course, our number one priority. But in terms of our companies, our business, our day to day, most of us are working from home now. So this overnight phenomenon has been a challenge for a lot of marketing leaders. I thought we'd begin with how does a marketing leader make the transition and motivate their team to now work from home if that was not what they were doing before?
This is the question of the year, maybe the decade or even the century at this point, given everything that happened. And it does seem like almost forever ago. You're correct, it was February 25th to the 28th in Salt Lake. I think we were literally the last company to do a live conference in the city of Salt Lake and the state of Utah for that matter. All of the conferences that followed us had to get canceled because of the coronavirus and COVID-19 issues. So we feel very fortunate to have that experience and have that in-person experience. And that's kind of where I'd start, Bernie, is that it's a different world when you're having to deal with people virtually versus in person. There's a lot of things you can do as a team and a lot of morale building, and it's just a lot of getting to know one another when you're in a shared office environment versus a work from home environment. I've had the great experience of doing both. So Adobe had constructed a new office in an area called Lehi, Utah, which is a split between kind of Salt Lake City to the north and Provo to the south. Lehi is now considered the heart of Silicon Slope. So there's a lot of businesses and a lot of office buildings going up. In fact, Zant, we're building a new office building as well that we're moving into in June. Needless to say, it's a different kind of experience when you have a team that's remote. Having done it for years until I came to Zant, I'd say there's a number of kind of best practices and things that we'll get into. But I think the key thing is really staying connected with your team. And by that, I mean, over communicating. For example, with my marketing team at Zant, we do a daily 8:45 a.m. check-in. So we're all on the same call. We're all connected together. We kind of run through what's up for the day. What are we passing through in our project management? We use Trello. What's on tap for the week and campaigns that we're running. So it's really important to have that. The fortunate thing is that we've all connected as a team before in the office, so we have that connection. But it can be challenging if you're new to a business and you haven't met anyone firsthand, haven't shaken hands. It can be some challenges in trying to connect with others that you haven't yet worked with.
Yeah, when you're having that regular morning meeting, have you found the transition to be challenging or different for some people? Just the dynamic of not being in person. And not everyone can just make the transition like flipping a switch.
That is the challenge, is giving your team, number one, I'd say make sure you're giving them the tools necessary and given the ability to succeed in a remote environment. So that would be things like make sure you have a good internet connection, you have a decent laptop, you have all the equipment. You and I are on professional microphones, so our sound will be much better than, say, if you're just talking through earbuds. But I think it's important, you have the physical infrastructure to support that. And then, of course, having a decent web conference platform. And again, I've used them all. I'm not promoting any one or the other, but we currently use Zoom, but I've used GoToMeeting. That's great. I've used Adobe Connect, of course, for the years I was at Adobe. Blue Jeans. I mean, I've probably used every single system, and they all have their pros and cons. But I think it's important. One of the things that we have done as a business, Bernie, is that we connect over video. And I think it's different when you're looking at someone in the eyes. Granted, it's through the computer screen, but if you're looking at everyone in the eyes and you're all engaged, that kind of almost forces a different kind of engagement versus if you're multitasking in the background, you're kind of half paying attention, half talking through the conversation. So I think that, those are some best practices that we recommend is, make sure you're on video as you're doing your calls.
At Vengreso, we're actually a virtual company. We've been a virtual company from day one. We've got people, not every continent, but several continents. So it's just been our way, since day one. And we actually have a policy. We don't enforce it strictly. It's more of a culture than it is a policy. And that is we meet on video. So we use Zoom.
Yeah.
And video is the default. We're always on video, unless every once in a while someone says, bad hair day or whatever, right? And that, okay, no problem. We can be human. But otherwise, it is always video. You're always communicating through video. So the facial expressions and the body language, and yeah, you can minimize the multitask factor as well. But for some people, that's a new culture and it takes a little getting used to.
Yep. As a manager, it's important to be empathetic, certainly in what's going on today. So everyone's going to have family issues. I mean, you'll have the dog coming into the room. You might have people that don't have a dedicated home office. So you have to be, I think, more sensitive and accommodating to those kind of scenarios. I think there's also, people are under a lot of stress. There's a lot of unknowns of what's happening in the marketplace. I think as a leader and as a manager of people, you have to take that into consideration as you're moving your office environment to a home environment. And now your team is distributed. And, in some cases, people take some while to learn how to work from home. It's not something, it's just like, oh, I'm at a different office. You're really not. You have all the distractions of home, which includes, hey, I want to go down to the kitchen, get a snack. I need to let the dog out. I've got kids that might not be in school now. All those kinds of distractions, and they're real. And so I think one of the things that we always recommend is make sure that you have both a physical as well as a psychological boundary that you set with your family and your team at home, if you will. Meaning, say goodbye to your kids in the morning when you're going to your home office. Yeah, it may be the bedroom or the basement or the spare office, but try and create that separation where you have that physical and that mental barrier between, hey, mom or dad is at work and now I'm back home.
Exactly. I'm reminded of a call that we were on just a few days ago, and it was two of us from Vengreso and two from another company. And one of them was a gentleman who clearly didn't have an office set up at home, so he was not used to it. And it was a kitchen table or something like that. And the kids were right there, and you can hear them, and it was loud. And at one point, he apologized. And his coworker, who happened to be superior to him in the company, was terrific, Matt. He said, hey, don't worry about it. Do not worry about it 1 minute. This is the new normal. In fact, it's awesome to hear kids in the background. He actually made him feel welcome about it. And you could visually see in his face, Matt, the stress come out of him. Like in that moment, he felt so much better because he was stressed out that his kids were loud in the background. And actually, the gentleman who said that was his boss. And it's like, don't worry about it.
Totally great. You just have to be more sensitive to those kinds of issues. And again, you might have people on your team that are really private. They don't want to kind of expose or share their personal or family life with their peers or their boss or whomever it might be. And, sometimes it can be like, hey, my kids are walking to the room because I don't have a dedicated office. And so there's all sorts of scenarios. I guess my primary point, and yours as well, is just be sensitive to your team and how they're trying to manage to this new normal.
Yep. So how do we manage? How do we manage projects and deliverables and results? How do we do that in this remote environment, especially with people who aren't accustomed to it?
Again, having infrastructure and systems in place, tools to manage that. So I mentioned we use Trello. In fact, that's new for us. We were on Rike as a project management platform. Again, I'm not voting for any one system or another, but the point is, particularly for marketing organization, we're typically one of the largest spenders in the business, and we're typically the one organization that has lots of running projects, concurrent and parallel projects that are at play. So I think it's important that you have visibility into how you're managing your marketing. So even if it's Excel spreadsheets, I think that can work as well. I would also highly recommend you have some kind of cloud-based file or application sharing, whether you're on Office 365 or on Dropbox or on, again, point being is if you can share, sharing files easily in a central shared location is critical. One of the things that Bernie, you and I talked about before this call was how you communicate with a team. And one of the ways that I do that is setting up kind of a hierarchy of communication. So the way I work is if you have something critically urgent for me, give me a call. If you have something urgent, but it's not like by the second, text me. If you have something that you need to get my attention on, but it's not super urgent, then you can send it to me through Microsoft Teams. That's our messaging platform that we use. And then lastly, if it's just informational, not urgent, send me an email. So it's kind of this cascading or this hierarchical approach, and making sure your team understands and knows that, I think, is really critical. So that way, as you're getting into projects and you're trying to launch campaigns or whatnot, between you and your team, you understand how to effectively manage expectations.
Every sales rep executes a cadence when they reach out via email, phone, or social media to initiate a conversation with a potential prospect. The art of a cadence is determined based on a myriad of factors, fueled primarily by sales reps' intuition regarding the company and contact that's being pursued. However, there are a lot of questions that aren't always clear when initiating a conversation and creating a successful cadence. Zant has authored the definitive guide to sales cadence. This ebook answers questions such as how many times should the rep attempt contact, how long should the rep wait between attempts, what methods are most effective, and many more. Download your free copy of the definitive guide to sales cadence at salescadenceguide.com. Again, that's salescadenceguide.com. In the office environment, when a little moment occurs of something good, a little win, we could do a high five, either literally or not literally these days, maybe a fist pump, or just even that moment of smiling together, like, hey, we figured that out, right? How do we do that when we're remote with our teams?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bernie. And that is one of the challenges, because we human beings, I think we're biologically wired to be around other people, other animals. Maybe we're herd animals, and we have to have that constant attention, even if it's not literal, high fives, but it's that psychological, hey, we're all winning at something and we can all share the woohoo or the high five or whatever it might be in the office. And now you can't do that. You're kind of isolated in your cell, in your home office, if you will. So I think that it's important to find wins like that. One of the things that we do, it's just kind of fun, is through Teams, we'll share funny gifts or just jokes, or just, try and keep some light banter in that. It's not all serious business all the time. And so if somebody has a win, we'll celebrate it and share it through Teams. I'll try to do, and I need to do this more often and get better at this, but celebrate, my individual team members and their wins throughout a week or throughout a month. As I mentioned, we had our Next 2020 conference, and it was extremely well received and well attended. And so we recognized our employee, Sarah Thompson, who led that, and, kind of shared that both, in one of our leadership meetings, as well as sharing that with the team. It's about finding those opportunities and just try to celebrate the small wins and the big ones. So if you have a big campaign and you've had great success with it, yeah, definitely celebrate that. But don't forget the small wins along the way of when someone, maybe they knock down a particular creative that's really interesting and engaging, compelling, whatnot. Celebrate that small win as well.
What about some of the best practices in terms of the regular meetings? When you're in the office and everyone gets into the conference room for a meeting, whether it's a 1-hour meeting or a 30-minute meeting, or sometimes longer meetings, over time, you kind of set up some protocols and some do's and don'ts, and everybody, eventually gets on board. But when you're meeting on a virtual conference platform, it's different. So how do you set up those protocols so that those meetings are productive and everybody participates?
Let me even just start, Bernie, with a couple things like get dressed and get ready for the day.
Good one.
One of the things I found when I started working from home is it's too easy to roll out of bed at, 5 minutes before the 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. meeting or whatever you have, and just kind of do it in your pajamas. One of the disciplines that I think really helps people get ready and focused on the day is go to work in your home office just like you're going to work in your regular office. I'd say that's number one. And by the way, we have a number of tips that we've posted on the Zant website. So if you go to zant.ai, go to our resources page, we have a blog posting about the 14 helpful tips for working from home while social distancing. We have 3 sections, tips for working, tips for managing your work schedule, tips for managing housemates, your family. And so these are some of the tips that we found work really well for our team. Do your exercise in the morning or at night, whatever you can do. And now we can't go to the gym, get a run in or a hike or something. But key is work your regular hours. Try not to be too flexible in the sense that you're always working or that you're always at home. So try to, again, maintain those boundaries. I'd say the same goes for meetings. Simply because it's gone virtual, you still have to have the same discipline as you would with an in-person meeting. And that means there should be an agenda and some objectives. What are you trying to accomplish in the meeting? In the virtual environment, I'd say it's almost easier to have meetings set up. One of the benefits of an office is there are physical constraints, meaning you only have so many conference rooms. It seems like we're always running out of conference room space, no matter what business I've been in. I think that's actually a good thing. It creates scarcity, which means that there's actually priorities you have to put on in-person meetings. So making sure you have an agenda and you have some key objectives you're trying to achieve, making sure you have action items and what are people actually accomplishing through that meeting. One of the things that I'm kind of a stickler on is what I call riding the mute button, which means always be on mute unless you're speaking. And that also helps as a leader, as a manager, it almost forces you to listen. So if you're on mute and no one can hear you anyway, now you have to listen to everybody else. So it's just a good discipline to encourage everyone to kind of have their say. I also just little things, my little quirks would be, do you guys follow me? Do you guys understand? Do you know what I'm saying? That kind of language and ask those kind of questions, because there can be a lot of things that are lost in translation because of the virtual environment. Back in the day when I was in the U.S. Air Force, there was a colonel or a general who said, quoting or paraphrasing one of the World War II generals, that basically said, never give an order that can be understood, always give an order that cannot be misunderstood. Meaning, if you're asking someone to do something, don't leave it to ambiguity or chance that they understand it. Make sure they clearly understand, hey, I'm asking you to take Hill 1, 2, 3, or I'm asking you to launch the campaign on Friday. Make sure that is not misunderstood by the team. And so meetings are a really great way to making sure you have that understanding and that cadence and ultimately that communication that you need to make sure everybody's kind of aligned in their operations.
Great point. I want to come back to something you kind of casually went over, and I want to come back to it because I think it's important, and that is hours. When you drive to the office or you take transportation to the office, you're there for X amount of hours. You get there and then you leave. When you're working from home, it's different. You're at home. So you said earlier, set up the boundaries, find your space, whatever that is. But how do you coach and manage people to work specific hours so that A, it's enough hours, like they're putting in a full day, but also so it's not too much and then it becomes unhealthy for them and their families?
Bernie, that's probably the hardest transition to make, is when you're turned on and you're in the office and working in the office, so to speak, and working, and when you're turned off and you're not. One of the problems I think we all have is that, we're all carrying our mobile phones and, we're always connected. So I'll get emails 24/7 or texts or some kind of communication from someone across the team, whether it's our leadership team or one of my team members in the marketing organization. There's always some issue that someone might have a brilliant flash of an idea at 10 o'clock at night. It can be very challenging to create that boundary and say, look, I'm turned off now. I'm not working tonight. I'm as guilty as anybody of spending way too many hours working in my home office when I should be not in the home office. One of the things that I try to do is schedule the entire day. So I'll schedule lunch, I'll schedule breaks, I'll try and schedule things so that your personal time and your personal sanity is sacred, and you've got to manage to that. So if you become a slave to the calendar and you become a slave to everybody else's needs and times, you're not going to have any time for yourself. So I think it's important that you literally, and if that means for you, if that means I'm scheduling dinner and I'm not working time, just block your calendar. I mean, we all have calendars, and when you block them, you can't have a meeting or something land on that. So I think everyone's got different ways they do this, but that's one of the ways that I do it. And Bernie, I'd love to hear what you guys do, and you and Mario at Vengreso. How do you guys manage that?
We have some are scheduled. We have regular meetings that are scheduled, and then we have just a whole bunch of meetings that just happen, right? They get scheduled. So in most cases, what we're doing is, and I don't think it's really planned, but it just ends up happening through our culture, and that is, I'll call it sort of the sandwich effect, meaning on the front end, we open up with something just fun and personal in terms of human. And then we conduct the meeting, using the best practices you mentioned. What's our agenda? What's our action items, and so forth. And then at the end, we always want to wrap up with a little bit of humor or something. So that sandwich is always in play. So that's something that I think we do pretty well. Personally, for me, something that I do that I'll share, Matt, with you and my listener, is that I have a dog. And so I take him for a walk somewhere around noon or 1 p.m., depending on what's on my calendar. It's short. He'd like it to be a little longer. It's 10 or 15 minutes, but that 10 or 15 minutes is actually huge. It's just,
Oh yeah.
it's a break from the physical home office that I have. It's outside. I live in Florida. The weather's usually good, pleasant. And that little break, that 10 or 15 minutes outdoors is really, really helpful to me. I mean, and if it doesn't happen, sometimes it doesn't happen based on, my calendar, I feel the difference. I really do.
Yeah.
That little break. And the key is not 10 or 15 minutes. It's the fact that it was outside. It was outdoors. That's huge.
I'd say it's really key, Bernie. Just something about blue sky and sunshine, that vitamin D or whatever, whatever those rays of sun do for you and do to you, really, really important. And I feel that too when I'm in an office and you're under the fluorescent lights or the LED lights, whatever they are these days. I often try to walk somewhere or go somewhere for lunch where I'm outside, like get outside the building. I know some of us used to work in when I was at Adobe, we had a beautiful cafeteria in the building. And it was great, go from the office on the fourth floor and you can walk down to the cafeteria and get food there. But there's something to be said about just getting outside, getting some fresh air, getting some sun, just to change the scenery, I think is really healthy and really important.
Absolutely. Well, Matt, we are at a point in the podcast where I am going to do a recap of the major talking points that we covered. And then I'm going to ask you to comment on it, add any commentary you'd like to add, and then we'll ask for your digital contact information and then bring this episode to a wrap. So we were here to discuss this timely topic of managing a remote marketing team in what we call the new normal. We began our conversation with your introduction to your company, Zant, formerly Inside Sales, and that you are a modern sales engagement platform for the enterprise, helping sellers better connect with buyers, and recently launched the first mobile access to that in the marketplace. And your career journey kind of came from Adobe, where you work with Chris Harrington, if I got the name correct, and kind of invited you to sushi, and the rest is history. And you joined InsideSales.com, did the rebrand, and our CMO at Zant, which is the sponsor of this episode. We, of course, discussed the fact that what we're dealing with is an overnight phenomenon, and how as recently as a few weeks ago, conferences like Your Next 2020, which was perhaps the last conferences that we know of that was in person, and then everything changed. So really, we began the conversation with how do you motivate, how do you inspire a team to work from home after being in an office environment? The first thing you said was staying connected and communicating, and even over communicating. You said you've got regular morning meetings where you do a check-in, you do it through video, and it's important to make sure that everybody has the tools that they need so that they can be effective and efficient and they can succeed. We've got to be empathetic to people. They're working from home. There may be pets and kids, and there's probably some stress along the way, so we have to be empathetic to that. And we need to provide our families, our teams need to provide. We encourage them to provide some physical and psychological boundaries with their families, like, hey, I'm at work now, so, respect that. And then in terms of how to manage teams, obviously using tools like a project management platform and a cloud-based file sharing system. And then you outlined your communication hierarchy. I jotted that down, and I'm gonna steal it, man. I love it. And that is, if someone has something critically urgent, call you. If it's not critically urgent, but it's still urgent, they can text you. If it's something that's it's important but not urgent, then use your internal system, which is Microsoft Teams. And then if it's just informational, use email. And I think the key point, Matt, is that you communicate this hierarchy of communication channels so that everybody understands and they're all on the same page. We also talked about the importance of really recognizing people, kind of celebrating small wins when, people experience something that's normally in the office, we would do a high five over, and really just keeping it human and making sure that people still get that recognition. Also making sure that they know when to start the day and when they should end the day. You made the point, get dressed and ready for the day just the same as you would if you were going to the office. And that includes things like maintain your exercise routine, maintain your regular work hours, and either don't cut them back or don't exceed them as well, so that you maintain that continuity. We talked about meetings, got to have an agenda, of course, just like a regular meeting, and action items. I love your comment of riding the mute button, meaning if you're not speaking, then have the mute button on the meeting platform. And this way, you really are kind of forced to pay attention. And then when you have something to say, you click the unmute button and then chime in. And then we kind of wrapped up with the whole work hours thing and the the challenge of being digitally connected. There is that temptation of being always connected, always available 24/7. And so we really have to kind of overcome and help our teams overcome the challenge of really managing those boundaries. And you mentioned things like schedule lunch, schedule breaks, block your calendar. I mentioned that I walk my dog every day for 10 or 15 minutes. So that's important, just important ways for people to really kind of manage their work hours. So Matt, I'm going to leave my summary there. Is there anything that you would like to add?
No, Bernie, this is a great summary. And I think the last point I wanted to make is really honing in on and practicing the art of listening. And you obviously did a great job listening to what I was saying and what I was trying to communicate through our conversation here. So I thank you for that. And I think as marketing leaders, it's really important for us to really be listening to our teams and really try and have that sense of what are they trying to say? What are they trying to communicate? Again, a lot of communication is kind of lost in translation when it's through a digital environment versus being live and in person. So I think it's incumbent upon us as marketing leaders to really focus on that and be better listeners as we transition to this new virtual work from home environment. So I think that's really important.
Well, Matt, where would you like to send my listener to connect with you online so they can connect with you and just learn more about what you've got going on at Zant?
Sure. Appreciate that, Bernie. I'd say number one, check us out on our website, Zant. That's Xant, Zant.ai. And we have a whole bunch of resources that are available to you there. And then if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, I'd love to connect with other marketers. I've been doing this a long time. Really enjoy connecting with other marketers. And so you can catch me on LinkedIn. It's Matthew, Matthew Langie, Langie. And happy to have you guys reach out and connect with me on LinkedIn. Let me know what you thought about this podcast and this episode and conversation with Bernie, and happy to connect with you there.
Fantastic. My listener knows that will be linked up in our show notes page. And Matt, I'm just going to mention to my listener that when you do reach out to Matt to connect on LinkedIn, make sure that you send him a personalized invitation. Let him know that you heard him on this podcast. And Matt, on that note, I just want to thank you for joining me here virtually on this episode of the Modern Marketing Engine podcast. Zant, the enterprise leader in sales engagement, has authored the definitive guide to sales cadence. This ebook answers questions such as how many times should the rep attempt contact, how long should the rep wait between attempts, and many more. Download your free copy of the definitive guide to sales cadence at salescadenceguide.com. Again, that's salescadenceguide.com. Hey, that's a wrap for this episode of the Modern Marketing Engine podcast. If you're not subscribed yet, I invite you to hit the subscribe button on your favorite podcast player. We're available on all the popular podcast listening channels. And hey, I'd love it if you would give the Modern Marketing Engine podcast a rating or review in Apple Podcasts. That really helps others to discover it. We publish a show notes page for every episode with links to the resources that were mentioned during the interview. Just visit our podcast page at Vengreso.com, and that's Vengreso. And remember, just one S in Vengreso. Hey, while you're there, sign up to get the podcast delivered to your inbox each week. And be sure to check out the Modern Selling Podcast, hosted by our CEO, Mario Martinez Jr. Hey, I hope that you'll tune in again next week for another inspiring interview to help you thrive on your modern marketing journey.